I thought I would start by explaining a little bit of how I got to this topic of this defection to Taiwan and this interesting picture here, and even the traces of these watermarks from their existence on the internet, and even the story that those can tell us, just by looking at how this photo has been used in different contexts. But as Dr. Goldstein was mentioning, I've done work in looking in the Republican period in China. Been thinking recently, last several years, more about the Japanese period in Taiwan, of 50 years of colonial rule in Taiwan. And then I realized that I wanted to put those things together with my newest project. And I wanted to think about after thinking about the Japanese period in Taiwan, I wanted to think about the Chinese period in Taiwan. The really clearly, explicitly moment of, 40 years when Taiwan was going to be Chinese, when the ROC government got to Taiwan after the surrender in 1945 and set out to make Taiwan a model province for the Republic of China. And I not only wanted to look at that moment of Chinese Taiwan, but I also wanted to think about this moment of Taiwan and China back in some sort of relationship, even though we usually think of the Cold War period as a time when there was very little in common between the two. And so we're used to thinking of, I think, the Cold War period of China and Taiwan as a time of great enmity and absolute opposites, and this crossing that you could never make. And you're either on the side of the communists in the mainland or you're on the side of the nationalists in Taiwan. And I started thinking about the few people who might be able to actually tell us something about both, and whose life stories and whose experiences and choices might actually tell us something about, again, both sides. And so I wanted to look into the defectors and the people who made their way from China to Taiwan. And so as Dr. Goldstein said, I'm working on a project that's going to cover the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then, again, the number of defectors that went from China to Taiwan and also from Taiwan to China. There was not quite as many going that way, but a significant number as well that I think will help us understand during the Cold War period, again, as we're used to thinking of China and Taiwan as such different regimes and different societies, but in fact, what did these places have in common? If the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party had these shared roots in the 19-teens and 1920s, how did that actually play out during the Cold War period? And how could we think about that moment as a time of the two sides looking across the strait and thinking about the other and designing their societies based on the other as well? But you see here this picture of Fan Yuanyan, who is a defector, and I'll tell you, so the talk today is really just a case study looking at his story, his defection in 1977. And we'll get to the moment of this photograph, really moving press conference where Fan appears the day after he defects in his MiG-19. And it's a very moving moment during the press conference when he stands up and he holds his service weapon in the air like that. And you can watch this on YouTube, and the press conference crowd goes wild. And I even like this picture. It looks like kind of a mess. It looks like the kind of picture you wouldn't want to use to be the first picture in your presentation, with all these watermarks, all these stamps all over it and stuff. But I like it for the kind of lifetime that it's had. And so it's in the middle, you see this GIO, so the Government Information Office of the ROC, and we can imagine the way that the ROC has used these images of defectors to Taiwan. So I'm going to be talking about that. But in the time since then, there's also the discourse that happens in China of these defectors and why did they do it and what perhaps should happen to them when we get Taiwan back, and if we want to go find these people in Taiwan, what might be an appropriate punishment to these people for having defected and betrayed the PRC. So I'll start with just a few other images of these defectors, just to give you a sense of who I'm talking about in this culture. Fan is not the first of these defectors to make it when he comes in 1977. And so by that time there had been, that was the 5th such defection incident, and he was the 8th pilot. And so some of them came by themselves, some of them came in planes with 2 or 3 people. And so these two here with Chiang Kai-shek are the first 2 of the defectors to make it. And the term we're going to be using, and the term that was used to describe these defectors, I've got here, 反共义士. And it's a difficult term to translate. The first part's easy enough, anti-communist, but the second part kind of harkens back to some more kind Confucian concepts of righteousness and warriors and things. And the typical translation that you get is something like anti-communist warrior, anti-communist defector, or something like that. But I wanted to keep something of the original feeling when you see this term of the 反共义士. So this is a term that we see used to describe this whole group of defectors again during the Cold War period. This is another of these defectors with Chiang Kai-shek, which is pretty typical to have these pictures taken. One thing we're going to see with these pictures is their use back shared with the mainland. And we'll see how people in the mainland were supposed to see these images and learn about what these defectors received when they got to Taiwan. This picture from the early 80s of two of these lucky fellows with Teresa Tang, or Deng Lijun, the great singer from Taiwan, who was very closely identified with anti-communism, whose songs Taiwan broadcast across the strait to China. And in fact, it was around this time that some of these defectors would come and they would say, I was moved to defect by listening to her songs. And so this is an important part of this whole history as well, as the role of this very beautiful singer and the song she sang about wanting to go back home to the mainland and the way it moved these people in the mainland to leave the mainland. And then another really interesting case, just to give you a sense of the diversity of the people who were coming, sometimes you would have pilots and they would seem to be leaving for very upstanding reasons, and sometimes you would have people who were simply hoodlums, criminals. This group of 6 people came more to escape criminal prosecution than anything, and they were saluted as anti-communist righteous men and women in this case, even though one of them, the fellow second from the right in that picture on the top, and the same guy who's in the front of that picture, he was actually executed in Taiwan in 2001 for having taken part in the kidnapping. He and another one of his fellow anti-communist righteous men had cashed in when they got to Taiwan. Again, we'll learn about what the rewards you get when you get to Taiwan, but they had gambled away all their money and they decided to kidnap the son of a big corporate bigwig and ended up with the death penalty. So it's an incredibly diverse group of people that make it to Taiwan, make this defection, but we're going to be focusing on the first of them again. Fan, whose picture you saw, and who on the 7th of July in 1977 got in this plane and decided to go for it. He was stationed in, he was stationed, I'm forgetting where he was, somewhere in southeast China. I've actually forgotten where he was right now, but he was supposed to be taking pictures of a shipwreck that was off the coast. And July 7th is a really important moment in Chinese and Japanese history. July 7th, 1977 was the 40th anniversary of the Marco Polo Bridge incident that started World War II between the Japanese and the Chinese in 1937. So the fact that he left on that day ended up as a really important fact as well. But he got in that plane on the 7th, went to 20,000 meters, and then decided to go for it, and as they said, fly to freedom in Taiwan. And so the story, when he gets to Taiwan, we see this, the coverage that we see when he gets to Taiwan is this very dramatic coverage of his reception. Here's the cover of a real quick book that came out probably within the next month or something. This is an image of another book. You see this is published in September 1977, so again, just within a couple months. And this, as you see, the title, Documented Evidence of how the Chinese Communists Impinge on Human Rights. But as a sense of the diversity of the publications that were covering this moment, this picture here is from People magazine. In fact, this issue of People magazine from 1977 with articles on Linda Ronstadt and Farrah Fawcett, and this was an important moment then in the US to think about this anti-communist move as well. And so the coverage that we see, and we meaning people in the West, people in Taiwan, is the coverage of him being brought down from his plane. It took him 27 minutes to get there, and then the coverage that we see again in consuming media is of him being brought down from his plane by these very happy members of the ROC Air Force. But we're also pretty clear that these pictures, and like this one here of him jumping down from his plane, we can bet that it was actually a pretty stressful environment. To see this plane come in from the mainland, to see it land there, no one knows what's going to happen. And because it was such a stressful environment, reporters were kept far across the tarmac, far away from the flight line as this was happening. And there are different versions, different newspapers and different magazines had different accounts of what his first words there. But this was a really important part of the narrative of what are the first words of an anti-communist defector when he makes it to Taiwan. And so the ROC newsreel of that week had him saying, "The mainland comrades' lives are too bitter. I am truly happy that I was able to seize freedom." The China Daily News in Taiwan had Fan blurting out, "You don't know how many people have starved to death under the CCP's authoritarian rule of the mainland." Meanwhile, the Washington Post had Fan opening more eloquently with, "Comrades, it's a communist who forced me to do this. I just cannot take it anymore. I came here to seek freedom and human rights which are totally lacking on the Chinese mainland." And again, we'll never know what those first words were because, again, reporters were kept far away. And we can bet, again, like I'm saying, it probably wasn't this joyous of an atmosphere as he was being removed from the plane and probably being questioned pretty closely for a while. But on the other hand, his welcome there inaugurates this really important narrative of, again, freedom on Taiwan versus communism in China. And so the plane, I showed you a picture of the plane, this MiG-19. This is actually not this prized by this time. The MiG-19 was developed in 1955. By this time, it had been used by the militaries of 26 different countries. So the plane itself was not really a big deal. The MiG-25 is actually, this is pretty nice, to get. And so in 1976, just the year before this, a Soviet pilot defected in his MiG-25 to Japan. And when that happened, the US sent their military personnel over. They photographed every inch of it. They brought the Soviet pilot to Washington. They set him up in this room with the reproduced cockpit and all the dials and the lights and stuff, and had him explain every single thing about the MiG-25. The MiG-19, by this time, isn't really anything special. So the plane is removed into the hangar, and people start messing with it and looking at it. But its main use, the career of this airplane, its main use is simply as an artifact of this defection. There's not much here that's technologically useful. But Fan himself was a much more valuable cargo. And he was swept by his new comrades here of the ROC Air Force into the pilot's lounge of the airport, and he immediately comments on the comfortable sofa, the plush carpet, the color TV set, and the cool air conditioning. They arranged for him to have an iced coffee and a President brand cigarette, and to get him a Sichuan-style meal. And again, the narrative then is set up almost instantly when he arrives in Taiwan, which are the comparison of privation in the mainland to this great material conditions in Taiwan, and then also the benevolent and caring reception that he received in Taiwan. The Young Warrior News reported the next day that Fan was greeted in Taiwan by 100,000 welcoming faces, lovely, respectful faces that Fan could have never dreamed of on the mainland. And so the narrative had to do with describing a natural, modern camaraderie that existed under the Qing government, under the KMT in Taiwan, which was the opposite of the inhumane, class struggle-based government that existed on the mainland. The next day, he was taken to star in an hour-long press conference. So I already showed you one of the photos from that moment, and it's at the Armed Forces Officers Club in Central Taipei. And there were 100+ reporters there, and this was broadcast live on CTS, or the Zhonghua network. It was part of 40 consecutive hours of Flight to Freedom coverage, as they called it. And this moment also helped to develop the narrative of defections, and again, why people defected, and what made the government in Taiwan so superior, and what made the society in Taiwan so superior. And they brought out, these pictures aren't great, but these are taken from, I must have gotten these from the video on YouTube, which is not of great quality. But they brought him out in his very coarse threadbare flight uniform, a light cotton shirt, blue trousers, this helmet and goggles that they made him wear out to this event. The people who are accompanying him are wearing suits and ties, but they've got him staged in this way to represent, in a way, the way that the pilots look on the mainland. In the image of Fan's primitive wardrobe, combined with the media's genuine elation at this playing out of freedom winning out over tyranny, and the welcome that they extended to Fan, make this a story, or serve to make this a story at that time of authentic Chinese democracy winning out over Soviet-style autocracy. What I also want to show in this event, and the treatment of Fan and the discussion of Fan, is a nationalist hubris that emerges about how this event shows that we're going to win for sure. And in the title, you saw that I call this moment the end of the nationalist China dream. And it's a very bitter moment because it starts with this great excitement. In 1977, when the US is very clearly moving towards normalizing relations with the PRC, this is thought to be a moment that could end that could prove to the world the depravity of life on the mainland and the superiority of the KMT in Taiwan. And the nationalist government and the media developed this real hubristic way of talking about this moment. We're also going to see, as I was referring to with his uniform and the discussions of what he was wearing, we see played out here a very superficial kind of materialism that mistakes the discrepancy between Asian Tiger era Taiwan and Cultural Revolution era China as an absolute moral victory for the KMT. And then finally, a blindness to the many actual similarities between communist and nationalist rhetoric of national salvation and revolutionary purity. And so when Fan comes out into the press conference area, he stands for about a minute for photographs. It's a very stiff situation, and eventually he starts kind of clapping back, as the audience is clapping for him. And the first question is, what were your motives in escaping to freedom? And he starts out you can tell he's kind of uncomfortable. He's got a very thick Sichuan accent. But one thing that's very interesting about this press conference is how familiar he is with the rhetoric of the KMT. And it turns out that he'd been listening to the anti-communist radio broadcast from Taiwan for a long time. By this time, the KMT had broadcasts going out towards northern, central, and southern China 24 hours a day in 8 different Chinese languages. And so he says that he had been thinking about coming to Taiwan since he had learned of Chiang Kai-shek's promised 6 freedoms and 3 promises. And this has to do with guarantees to members of the Communist Party and the PLA that they will be treated as fairly and equally under the law, equal rights under the Constitution of the ROC, and protection of life and property when they make it to Taiwan. It's also interesting, though, that over time he had come to misremember those 3 promises in terms that seem much more Maoist and much more appropriate to the environment that he was living. And he remembered the 3 promises as being, if you show up in Taiwan and defect, you won't be killed, you won't be struggled against politically, and you won't be investigated personally by the party. As he goes on, though, this initial unease starts to give way to this very authentic seeming eloquence and bitterness and rage. And he tells how he left his family behind, in fact, to make it to Taiwan. He gave emotional testimony to the miserable lives lived by the 800 million people of the mainland, in his words, especially the farmers who had nothing to eat or wear, the constant trickery and lies practiced by the CCP, the repeated attempts at popular uprisings against the regime, and the lack of any real political or social freedoms. And the 4th question of the session, his answer to the 4th question of the session was that he pledged to fight on the front lines to take back the mainland. And he got a standing ovation. And he also got a standing ovation when, another picture of the same moment in the press conference, when he stands there with his service pistol. And it's an interesting pose, to stand there with a gun as 24 hours ago he's an enemy and now he's one of them. And it's an interesting way to show his investment now in the ROC society. But it becomes an emotional moment too, because he goes from this pose to thinking about his family, and he talks about how he perfectly expects the government to retaliate against his family. And so it's a very moving press conference as well, and it makes for a very quick and dramatic introduction to Taiwan society for fun. Another part of this event that was really integral to the way that this was experienced was how it was covered by the media. And one interesting thing, when you look at the coverage in the media of Fan's defection, there seems to be just as much coverage of the coverage itself as there is about Fan. And that is to say, this moment in 1977 of Fan making this, defecting in this way and taking this flight to freedom seemed to be a moment for the ROC to show off their very technologically advanced society. 1/5 of the official ROC newsreel on the event was dedicated to showing its viewers images of earlier viewers of live coverage of Fan. So we see images, people watching coverage of the Fan press conference in TVs, in public scenarios, out on the street, next to a noodle stand, in their homes. And so we get a sense of Taiwan being presented as a technologically advanced society, joined by bonds of nationalism, anti-communism, and people celebrating this moment together. And again, that this sort of camaraderie is always expressed as being the opposite of the inhumane, class-based, class struggle kind of society that was part of the Maoist experiment on the mainland. They also talked a lot about how their coverage of this Fan event was shared all over the world. And one article was titled, From Taipei to the World. And the news director for CTV pointed out that this was the first time that all 3 major American TV networks depended on ROC broadcasts for their reports. Taiwan's academic and media communities began working quickly to construct different kinds of discourses about this event. One political scientist said that this event represented 800 million mainland compatriots' humane cry for freedom or death in a society that had ravaged human rights, destroyed the rule of law, and regressed to primitive barbarism. The New Life News used this event to register the opinion that communism is a bankrupt ideology, a system that should not exist, an impractical society with no ideals and no future. Fan can denounce to the free world the bloody reign and tyranny of the communist bandits. Others spoke to that moment of U.S. PRC negotiations, saying that this defection was a ringing, sharp warning to the international countercurrent of pro-PRC appeasement. So some people talked about the specific failings of the CCP that sent Fan on his way and other defectors like him. Others developed this into a very hubristic narrative of impending triumph. The Young Warrior News gloated that this event was the one leaf that tells you it's autumn. The communist bandits, who by now have been abandoned by the masses and deserted even by their relatives, will totally collapse and perish. This is imminent, right before our eyes. The precise proof and material confirmation of late President Cheng's saying that tyranny shall perish. We will soon recover the national territory of the mainland. So of course now, 39 years later, we can look back on that with some irony and some humor. But it's interesting to see how many people were very certain of this at this moment, that the defection of this one person was truly an event that had such important, that forebodes such great changes between China and Taiwan. Other publications talked about this event in different ways. The Young Warrior News had another article interviewing an overjoyed elderly woman on the streets of Taipei, and she heard about Fan's defection, and she laughed loudly and said, "Wonderful, the communist bandits are going to fall. Now we can take our old bones back to the mainland." And there weren't very many triumphs in Taiwan at this time. Besides Little League Baseball, there weren't very many moments that Taiwan was out there on the world stage winning and showing themselves to be a superior bet to the PRC, but this was one. There's another discourse that was developing, and as I was talking about Fan's clothing and the way that it was discussed, but as I was saying, a triumphalist discourse that used his flight suit, or technically his lack of a flight suit, and in this very superficial, very materialist way, in a very condescending way, took this to represent ROC superiority. Many saw in Fan a Chinese gaucheness that residents in Taiwan should have been grateful to have left long behind. So there were all sorts of comments on these military casuals. Now, part of what's important about him and if I can go back to his uniform here, part of what's important about his defection is that he did not wear a flight suit that day when he got in his airplane and went to 20,000 meters to defect. If he had put on a full flight suit, people would have understood that he had something perhaps else in mind than his photographic mission that he was supposed to be conducting. So his choice to not wear a modern flight suit, to only wear these casuals, is part of his strategy to pull this off, to make the defection in the first place. But in Taiwan, there's no appreciation for that. All they do is look at his uniform and compare, again, these military casuals to the very fancy uniforms that their Air Force pilots wore. During the press conference, this first press conference, one reporter asked Fan to describe the state of the mainland economy, considering that the clothes he wore were made of very poor material. The Central Daily article on the press conference opened with a description of Fan speaking with an extremely heavy Sichuan accent, dark, skinny, with clothes that were not ripped but extremely coarse. His standard issue shirt not really yellow or white. The China Daily talked about him as being skinny and dark, his clothing extremely crude, made of fabric as coarse as that which was used in the war against the Japanese. You could never find an item of clothing of this poor quality in our military today. Another report opened with a description of Fan as clumsy and awkward, a classic Sichuanese, described his military issue jacket as old and disintegrating, not like that of our ROC pilots who were so handsome and chic. The United Daily News opined that if Fan didn't have to wear such a shoddy uniform, he would look like a handsome and dignified foreign service official, and also compared his crummy cotton jacket to the handsome and chic uniforms that pilots usually wear. Now, what's interesting about this discourse in 1977 is that many people in the media seem to have forgotten that really superficial materialism was at the heart of communist critiques of the KMT to begin with, all the way back to the 1920s, and what was wrong with bourgeois culture, and what was wrong with the kind of public culture and media that concentrated on the quality of someone's dress. But again, that's part of the hubris of this all. Newsweek, in their report on this event, talked about how the Civic Center in Taipei even put the clothes that Fan was wearing when he defected on display, underwear and all. And so again, what you see here is that in Taiwan in 1977, it wasn't enough to talk about Maoist rule and what was wrong with it, specifically the crimes of the Communist Bandit Party, as they called them, but there needed to be material evidence of what was so inferior about Communist China as opposed to free China. There's another really important part of this narrative, which is the huge reward that Fan got. And this is something that became fascinating any time that any of these pilots would make their way to Taiwan. It was a very important part of how the story was told of these defectors. And in 1960, the ROC had instituted an official policy for awards to communist bandit Air Force officers and airmen who rise in insurrection and return home. And the returning home part is kind of tricky because, of course, these people had never been to Taiwan. But what they meant by returning home was to return to the site of the Republic of China government under which people like him had been born before 1949. But this policy for awards spelled out different kinds of rewards for pilots depending on what kinds of planes they were able to take from the mainland and fly to Taiwan. And so the system of rewards was widely advertised to the mainland via the radio broadcasts that I mentioned earlier, and then also via balloon airlifts that dropped propaganda leaflets all over the mainland. So I have pictures here, so I can go through. These are more of the images of again, the people watching the coverage, and this is from the official newsreel of this moment. But again, 1/5 of that newsreel, as I was saying, was dedicated to showing people watching the coverage. And so, an interesting twist there. But as I was saying, many of the things that the ROC government wanted people to learn about Taiwan, again, could be sent by radio broadcast or could also be sent via these hydrogen balloons that drop propaganda leaflets along with nationalist swag like toys, cooking oil, underwear, soap, and cups with removable anti-communist slogans. And this is quite an operation. The underground factories were set up in the offshore islands off Taiwan to take hydrogen out of seawater and then to lift these balloons. Low-altitude balloons could carry 800 pounds of leaflets and goods. The high-altitude balloons that were sent up towards Mongolia carried 20 pounds of leaflets. And there were 6 months out of the year when the northern winds would allow this to work. And this is kind of an interesting thing as well, because the PRC side would also conduct these similar kinds of balloon airlifts the other 6 months. But as you can see from the size of Taiwan and the PRC, it's a lot easier to hit the PRC with your stuff than it is for the PRC to put stuff and hit Taiwan. So that actually didn't work so well for them. But I found in the Academia Historica archives in Taiwan, I was able to find some material on these airlifts. And I found a letter that was marked top secret. And it was about a December 1965 airlift over 20 locations in Guangdong and Guangxi province. And so in that year, 1965, on the 20th of December, just as one example of these operations, one plane left loaded with 700 pounds of leaflets advertising the most recent defection at that time. And so here's another kind of lower tech kind of balloon lift that you could send stuff over with. But I have some images of the leaflets that were sent over. And so some of these leaflets that were dropped either by plane or sent over by balloon had, as you see here, coordinates, distances from different airports to make it to Taiwan on the left. On the right, you see the price scale or the reward scale, depending on what kind of plane you can bring over. So this was at a moment from the mid-60s or so when the MiG-19 was the top price. But again, by the time Fan came, there were further, more advanced fighters than that. Here's another leaflet, an example of a defector from let's see. I think he went in 1963, and so this leaflet is probably from the mid-60s. And these would often show, again, it would mention that he got his 1,000 ounces of gold for making it Taiwan with his MiG-15, again in the early 60s. And some of the pictures, some of the leaflets would have pictures like this that would show a different element of life in Taiwan. And so this is the picture that gets sent back to the mainland after Fan makes it, and it's him with 4 previous defectors and their new wives that they're given in Taiwan. And so this also becomes part of the propaganda as well. And Fan himself gets a new wife after a short time in Taiwan. He's unfortunately left his wife and 3 kids back in the mainland. But part of the deal seems to be something like this, that if you're that brave and you make it all the way, then the government will set you up and you can have a family in Taiwan as well. Now, what's also interesting about the women that are married to these men is that they're picked for them by the government and they're all spies. They're keeping very close track of these defectors, because what do we know about these defectors? Maybe above anything, we know that they're traitors, in a way. So the knowledge of these defectors is also tempered by the fact that they're traitors. So there's this rejoicing about them coming to Taiwan and revolting against communism in that way, but there's also part of the consciousness about them is that they're also the kind of people who leave their families behind. And if they've done it once, well, they might do it again. These pilots who make it, again, there were 13 different defection incidents by these pilots. There were 18 separate figures who made it. None of them ever flew planes for the ROC Air Force after they made it. They were all given positions in the ROC Air Force. They were all promoted from their rank in the PLA Air Force. They're all promoted to the next rank up in the ROC Air Force, but none of them ever got in an airplane again, because what's to say they wouldn't just fly back to China. And so their lives were interesting, and you could make a case for them being tragic in many ways in some of their cases. But part of the allure, as I said, was these great rewards. And so by defecting in his MiG-19S copy, Fan was eligible for a reward of 4,000 taels of gold, or 150 kilograms of gold tax-free. And so they would conduct these ceremonies where they would be honored, they would be given medals and things, and there would be this huge tray on a podium in front of the ceremony, and the tray would have a big stack of gold bars on the tray, and it was very impressive. Now these men never actually got the gold bars; they would get the cash equivalent. But the gold bars always looked a lot better than just the bank account. It's not as much fun to wave your passbook in the air. But the big pile of gold bars was a much more eloquent statement about the money that the ROC had to throw around and how they were going to attract people to do this. On the other hand, that message also really compromises the message of part of the message of his defection in the first place. And the idea that he defected because he was so sick of life in the mainland. He was so disgusted by the way that the Communist Party was. Once we know that they were coming and getting these massive rewards, people weren't quite sure what to make of them. And so everywhere, every article about these defectors, they always would mention what the reward was, how many taels of gold and what the amount is. And so these 4,000 taels of gold were the equivalent of $24 million in NT, or $600,000 US. And when the average annual income in Taiwan is about 3,000 US at this time, this makes it complicates this narrative. And so as I was saying, part of the problem is if he's really that sick of life in China and really that interested in coming to KMT-ruled Taiwan, wouldn't that be enough? Why would you have to have this great payment? And so it became something for people in Taiwan to very often critique. Why are we giving these huge payments to these people who are, again, the kind of people who leave their families behind? In 1979, the first issue of Formosa, the magazine of Taiwan's democratic movement, had an article that talked about this as a fascist tendency, the practice of giving these big payoffs and worshiping mythological idols. Now, Fan would try to say that it was never about the money, and in fact, at his press conference, he made a distinct point of saying that he flew to Taiwan for freedom, not for money, and he got a standing ovation. He's praised in the newspaper for his admirable sentiment in a money-worshipping society. Sometimes he went further than this and said that he had not known a thing about the rewards, despite the fact, as we were saying earlier, that he actually knew very many things from these broadcasts. He was very familiar with Chiang Kai-shek's 6 Freedoms and 3 Promises and talked about monitoring these broadcasts. And so it's actually quite hard to believe that he would have come all this way and not known about these payments. But it tells us something about the stigma that it brought as well. Now, he was so uneasy about this money that as soon as he got to Taiwan and was given this big prize, he started looking into returning it because he was tired of always having to answer these questions. The government wouldn't let him return it, though, because of how it would look. If they were offering great rewards that then you had to give back as soon as everyone turned off the TV, well, that wouldn't look very good. He was trying to donate it later that month to victims of Typhoon Thelma and Typhoon Vera, but the nationalists also wouldn't let him do that as well. So he just stuck it in the bank and never paid for anything, because anywhere he would go in Taiwan, people would pay for his dinner and pay for his clothing and things. But the money, even though it was nothing that he ever could spend or enjoy, it was always part of the narrative. And he was always suspected, as were many of these other figures, often suspected of having defected only in order to cash in this way. And I'll look at one more element of this defection as well. And it comes with the media coverage and the looking to Fan as a voice of kind of amazement, and someone who was asked to be constantly impressed by Taiwan and how wealthy Taiwan was. And so very quickly after arriving, he was given a radio show called Fan Yuanyan Time on Broadcasting Corporation of China. And it was, he would tour department stores, schools, factories, hospitals, homes around the island. And his job pretty much during this radio program was to go into someone's home or to go into a hospital or something and compare and say, wow, this is so much nicer than homes in China. This is so much nicer than hospitals in China. But this is also something that was very authentic. And so in episode 3 of the program, he was talking to a 12-year-old boy during summer vacation. It's July when he makes it. And Fan still proves to be kind of confused about life in free China. And so the boy is talking about being on summer vacation, and Fan asks him, so you don't need to do labor during summer vacation? And in the broadcast, you hear the boy and his dad laugh, kind of awkwardly. And Fan asks the question again, no, really, why aren't you doing labor during summer vacation? And the dad and the boy are like, they say, we don't know what you mean. Why would I be doing labor during summer vacation? And Fan says, oh, in the mainland, first graders have to dig holes and collect fertilizer during the summer. And so they're both authentic comparisons, but there's also this pattern of talking about life in Taiwan as life in heaven as opposed to living in China as life in hell. And what we see as you listen to these programs and you follow Fan in the media over the next several months is the second thoughts that he starts to have about the implications of Taiwan's material wealth. And he tells one interviewer, the Communist Party says that communism is heaven, but that's a total lie. The real heaven is here, where the common people have air conditioning, refrigerators, everything they could eat, everything they could wear, everything they could use. What else could they want? We start to see him having some impatience and perhaps misgivings about this free society. He starts to betray traces of that old communist distrust of bourgeois culture. And he talks about how the first day he got to Taiwan, he was disappointed to see in the Tainan airport where he landed young women with eye makeup and wearing clothes that really reveal way too much skin. And he became known as a scold in the media. And he would complain about TV shows as decadent. He talked about the musical and variety shows where he thought that the women singers wriggle so much. He talked about the women who write letters saying they want to be friends with him and how disgusted he was by that. He talks about the young men of Taipei who wore pants that were too tight and too sexy, the commonplace drug use, pornography, gender bending, and cross-dressing that he thought were emblems of a sick society. And so Fan transforms very quickly. Just even in his first summer there, he goes from being a communist, an anti-communist hero to becoming a very conservative scold. He could be asked to reflect on the weaknesses of the free world. He talked about America and Japan as examples of societies where people were having a harder and harder time controlling their desires. He was asked about the media, and he thought that one solution would be if the government had more control of print and broadcast media. He thought that Taiwan's newspapers were full of strange and bizarre content, and the TV shows spoke to too little patriotic and collectivist thought, too much selfish and self-serving thought. And he worried about this soft society in Taiwan. And he said, when the war comes with the communists, it will not be a joke. That's when someone truly has to risk one's life. At this moment, will people be able to give up their material possessions? And so he became this very conservative scold. In the couple years after Chiang Kai-shek died, you can start to see him being used by conservative members of the KMT who perhaps didn't like these new freedoms that were starting to develop in the mid-1970s. And so he became uniquely qualified to describe to those people in Taiwan what they perhaps had forgotten about the true nature of China's 20th century revolution. And so I think maybe I'm noticing the clock here, and so I think I would probably wrap it up here. And by saying that, again, that his defection revealed these different elements of the anti-communist discourse I think are really important. I think anti-communism is something that isn't studied very often. I don't think there aren't very many studies of that way of thinking. I think it's often thought of as just simply a reactionary kind of discourse, that communism is the real kind of agent of history and anti-communism is simply reaction to the real thinkers. But I also think it's important to see how anti-communist discourse changed over time and how that could be different in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so again, that this really gives us a sense in the 1970s of the hubris and the certainty that people felt in Taiwan that this would be the event that changed people's mind and that would save the ROC on Taiwan and their plans to retake the mainland. And I think it's also interesting and the joy that people experienced in Taiwan, so many of those mainlanders who had come to Taiwan in the late 40s, people who'd been there for 30 years by this time, away from their homes, and that this flight, where he made it to Taiwan in 27 minutes, somehow opened up this idea for them, or this space for mainlanders in Taiwan, that maybe it's going to be their chance to go home pretty soon. The freedoms and human rights officially celebrated in their ROC were a source of pride, but evidently no substitute by this moment for their dreams of returning home. So I think it's also a time, it's also an event that gets us thinking about the real trauma of that separation after 1949, and all those people who were stuck on one side or the other, away from their families, and how this event gave those people some hope, but then very quickly after that, dashed that hope as well. I think I've taken enough time up here talking about myself, but I'd love to take questions if people have them.